They were brother and sister, born into a dynasty where the bloodline was considered a form of currency and power, the only true inheritance. Their world was one of gilded halls and whispered secrets, where the map of their kingdom was more important than the map of their own hearts. From their earliest days, they were taught that their worth was intertwined, not through the tender bonds of family, but through the cold, hard calculus of political alliance. To marry outside the family was to dilute their claim, to share their divine right with lesser blood. So, the path was set for them, a grim and inevitable road they walked with the solemnity of high priests entering a temple. He was groomed for kingship, she for queenship, and the union between them was spoken of not as a marriage but as a merger. The wedding was the most spectacular event the kingdom had ever witnessed, a week-long festival of feasts and tournaments designed to showcase the unassailable strength and unity of the ruling house. They stood at the altar, two figures of immense power and profound isolation, exchanging vows that felt less like promises and more like the clicking into place of the final piece of a strategic puzzle. The crowd saw a golden couple. A closer look would have revealed the tension in their clasped hands, the way their eyes met with a familiarity that held no warmth. Their life together in the months that followed was a carefully staged performance. They held court, they issued decrees, they presented a united front to the nobles and the common people alike. In public, they were the epitome of regal partnership. In private, they were two strangers who shared a childhood and now shared a bed, bound by duty and a chilling, shared understanding of their purpose. The love that should have been between siblings was twisted into the cold obligation of spouses, and the affection that might have grown between spouses was poisoned by the ghost of that sibling bond. Their palace was a mausoleum for the people they might have been. The news of her pregnancy was met with jubilation throughout the land. Bells rang in every city, and poets composed odes to the glorious future. For the two of them, however, the news brought a more complex, private dread. It was the moment their theoretical duty became terrifyingly real. They had fulfilled the first part of their destiny, now they awaited the result. As her belly swelled, so did the silent anxiety within their gilded cage. Superstition, that old serpent that slithers through even the most enlightened courts, began to whisper. The priests offered sacrifices to the gods, but their prayers felt hollow, desperate attempts to ward off a fate they had invited. The birth was a long and harrowing ordeal, shrouded in secrecy. The most trusted midwives and physicians were summoned, sworn to absolute silence. When the cries of the first child finally pierced the air, it was not a sound of pure joy, but one mingled with a gasp of horror. Then came the second cry, a mirror of the first. The twins, a boy and a girl, had been born. They were alive, but they were deformed. Their tiny bodies were twisted, their features marred by the cruel hand of a genetic betrayal that everyone had feared but none had dared to name aloud. The air in the chamber grew thick with terror and despair. The king looked upon his children, and for the first time in his life, the mantle of power felt like a shroud. This was the fruit of his and his sister's ambition, the living, breathing consequence of their sin against nature. The queen, exhausted and weeping, turned her face to the wall, unable to bear the sight. The grand design, the perfect consolidation of power, had produced this tragedy. The very blood they had sought to keep pure had turned against them, creating a monument to their folly. The physicians muttered about humors and imbalances, but everyone in that room knew the true, unspeakable cause. A decree was immediately issued. The queen was resting, and the royal heirs were fragile and would be kept from the public eye until they were stronger. The truth was locked away in the highest tower of the palace, guarded by a select few whose loyalty was ensured by fear and gold. The twins were given names, but those names were never spoken beyond the innermost chambers. They were cared for with a clinical, fearful tenderness by wet nurses and servants who averted their eyes. Their parents visited rarely, each visit a fresh wound. The king would stand over their cradles, his face a stony mask of grief, while the queen could only weep, her body shaking with a sorrow too profound for words. The world outside, of course, was not so easily silenced. Rumors, like weeds, began to sprout in the fertile soil of secrecy. The people whispered of a curse, of divine displeasure, of monstrous births. The court, a hive of intrigue, buzzed with speculation. The rival noble families, who had been subdued by the powerful union, now saw a crack in the foundation. Their sympathy was a thin veneer over a growing sense of opportunity. The king and queen's power, once thought absolute, now showed a fundamental weakness. Their legitimacy was intrinsically tied to the perfection of their bloodline, and that perfection was a lie. Life within the palace transformed into a grim charade. Public appearances became agonizing exercises in deception. The king's speeches, once filled with booming confidence, now carried a hollow echo. The queen's smile, once a symbol of serene grace, became a fragile, trembling thing. They played their parts, but the life had gone out of their performance. The love they had never managed to cultivate for each other was now replaced by a shared, corrosive guilt. They were partners in crime, bound by a transgression that had manifested in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. The twins, unaware of the political storm their existence had caused, grew in their secluded nursery. They were not monsters in spirit, they were children. They learned to smile, to grasp at fingers, to make soft, babbling sounds. Their deformities were a part of them, but their caregivers, over time, saw past the twisted limbs and unusual features to the innocent souls within. This made the situation all the more tragic. They were not embodiments of evil, they were victims of their parents' ambition, paying a physical price for a sin they did not commit. Their every coup was a silent accusation. As the years passed, the strain began to warp the rulers themselves. The king became increasingly paranoid, seeing treason in every questioning glance. He tightened his grip on power, his edicts growing more severe, his punishments more brutal. It was as if he could silence the whispers about his children by silencing the entire kingdom. The queen retreated into a world of prayer and isolation, seeking absolution from gods who seemed to have turned their backs. She spent hours in the chapel, not in pious devotion, but in desperate bargaining, begging for a miracle that would never come. The palace, once a symbol of opulent power, became a gilded prison for its inhabitants. The laughter that had occasionally echoed through its halls was gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. The courtiers moved through the rooms like ghosts, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting nervously. The very air seemed to thicken with unsaid things, the name of the children, the reason for their seclusion, the terrible mistake that hung over the dynasty like a shroud. The grandeur of the tapestries and the sparkle of the chandeliers only served to highlight the deep, festering decay at the heart of it all. The king attempted to combat the rumors with displays of even greater power. He launched a costly war against a neighboring state, hoping a military victory would rally the people and distract them from the sickness at home. The campaign was successful in a strategic sense, adding new territories to the map, but it was a hollow victory. The soldiers returned to a kingdom that felt morally bankrupt, led by a man whose own house was not in order. The spoils of war could not cleanse the stain on the royal lineage. Meanwhile, in the tower, the children grew. They learned to walk, their gaits unsteady and painful. They learned to speak, their words sometimes slurred. They knew no other world but their few rooms and the small, walled garden where they were allowed to take the air, always under cover of darkness. They knew their caregivers, and they knew the two sad, imposing figures who visited on occasion, the woman who wept and the man who stood like a statue. They felt the love of their nurses, but they also felt the weight of their own existence, a pervasive sense of wrongness they were too young to name. The queen, in a moment of desperate clarity, tried to connect with her daughter. She brought her a doll, beautifully crafted with porcelain features and a silk dress. The little girl, with her own crooked hands, reached for it with a look of wonder. But when she tried to hold it, her grip failed, and the doll fell to the stone floor, its face shattering into a dozen pieces. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. The queen fled, her sobs echoing down the corridor, and never attempted such an intimacy again. The incident became a perfect metaphor for her motherhood, a beautiful offering resulting only in destruction. The political situation continued to deteriorate. Pamphlets began to circulate in the city, anonymously published, detailing, with wild inaccuracy but chilling effect, the monsters in the palace. They spoke of the gods' wrath and called for a new, purer line of succession. The king's response was swift and terrible. Dissenters were arrested, printers were hanged, and a new wave of fear swept the capital. But you cannot kill a rumor, only its messengers. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, moving from the taverns into the very halls of government. A faction of powerful nobles, led by a distant cousin who had long coveted the throne, began to openly challenge the king's authority. They did not speak of the children directly, that was still too dangerous, but they spoke of unfitness and divine disfavor. They argued that the kingdom was suffering under a curse, that crops failed and illnesses spread because the throne was tainted. The king, isolated and embittered, saw the challenge for what it was. The very power he had married his sister to secure was now slipping through his fingers because of the fruit of that union. The tragedy reached its peak during a harsh winter. A fever swept through the palace, finding easy prey in the confined, weakened bodies of the twin children. The boy, always the frailer of the two, succumbed first. His death was quiet, a final, shallow breath in the night. The girl followed him 2 days later, her body unable to fight the infection. Their short, hidden lives were over, extinguished like candles in a storm. In death, they finally left their tower, their small coffins carried secretly through the snow to be interred in the royal crypt in an unmarked tomb. The news was delivered to the king and queen as they sat by the fire in their great hall. There was no outburst, no dramatic cry. The king simply nodded, his face ancient and impassive. The queen closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek before she wiped it away. It was not the grief of parents who had lost children they had known and loved, but the grief of those who had lost the symbols of their failure, the living reminders of their sin. The burden was lifted, but the scar remained, permanent and deep. The kingdom, of course, was told a different story. It was announced that the royal heirs, long in fragile health, had finally lost their battle with a childhood illness. The public mourning was official and subdued. People lit candles and said the required prayers, but their true feelings were a mixture of pity, suspicion, and a strange sense of relief. The unsettling chapter was closed. The tangible evidence of the royal curse was gone. But the damage was irreversible. The king and queen were now just a broken man and a broken woman ruling over a broken court. The cousin who had challenged them grew bolder, his faction stronger. The war had drained the treasury, the king's paranoia had alienated his allies, and the queen's retreat from public life had eroded her influence. They were rulers in name only, their authority hollowed out from within. The power they had sought to cement through their union had been utterly destroyed by its consequences. In the end, they were deposed not by a bloody revolution, but by a quiet, political coup. The nobles presented the king with an ultimatum: abdicate in favor of his cousin and retire to a remote estate, or face a public trial for tyranny and incompetence. He knew he had no choice. The power he had once held so firmly was gone, evaporated like mist. He signed the document of abdication with a hand that did not tremble, for he had nothing left to lose. They left the palace as they had entered it, together. But there was no pretense of a merger now. They were two ghosts, boarding a plain carriage that would carry them into exile. They did not look back at the spires of the home they had lost. They had sacrificed everything for that place, their personal happiness, their moral integrity, and the very lives of their children. And in the end, it had given them nothing but a lifetime of regret. Their final years were spent in a small, comfortable manor house, provided for by the new regime who wanted them forgotten. They lived separate lives under the same roof, he wandering the gardens, she staring out the window. They rarely spoke. The shared experience that should have bound them, the loss of their children, the collapse of their world, only served to widen the chasm between them. Their love had been a political strategy, their children a biological imperative, and their downfall an inevitability. Their story became a cautionary tale, a grim lesson in the dangers of absolute power and the unforgiving laws of nature, a reminder that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed, and that the price of such transgressions is often paid by the innocent.